All right, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's welcome to AEI. It's really great to see so many friends, former VNC staff, alumni of the program, also the students from the American Studies program. Thank you for joining us. We're going to see you again on Monday, so you're getting a heavy dose of AEI. Hope you're not tired of us after that. So as most of you know, Values and Capitalism, not technically today, I'm not sure the exact birth date, but this year is celebrating its 10th anniversary, which is a real milestone for the initiative, and it's one that reflects a lot of hard work of a lot of people. I specifically want to mention the former VNC staff, several of whom are here today: Eric Tietzel, Greg Lane, Sterling Emmerling, Josh Good, Meredith Lee, who isn't here because she just had a baby, so that's a good excuse. Molly Moore, Tatinda Mbika Cheche, I can say that, I've said it a lot. And also the current staff, Ariana Petrosky-Roberts, Kate Westrick-Schneider, and Katya Liebman. I also want to thank dozens of interns who have contributed to our initiative, including several who are here as well: Jacqueline Isaacs, Elise Daniel, Hannah Wardell, Adela Antal, and Mitch Barron. Pretty much any organization or program or initiative is only as good as the people that constitute it, and Values and Capitalism has seen some pretty great folks. But what is it that we've accomplished and are celebrating after 10 years? So we did the numbers, and I'm just going to throw some big numbers at you. We have hosted 60 major conferences or programs for students and faculty, 551 on-campus events reaching over 55,000 students, 25 major public events hosted in DC, 5 summer honors programs resulting in 295 alumni, 5 weekend honors programs resulting in 114 alumni, over 300 student alumni of our Executive Council program, and 158 current students in the program at 33 Christian colleges, 20 Young Scholars Program alumni and 6 current students in the program, 326 faculty partners and 5 visiting professors, 22 books or essays published and over 60,000 sold, 1 full-length documentary and 22 videos produced, plus another documentary currently in production. So that is in number, yeah, all right. That's a lot of numbers, but numbers are really, at the end of the day, just numbers. And so when I think about what this initiative has really accomplished in a decade, there are 4 probably major things. So first, in many ways, after 10 years, AEI is now the go-to policy think tank for Christian colleges and Christian college students and faculty. I think this is important because it means that students from across the political spectrum who are interested in politics, policy, and economics are coming to AEI to pursue those interests. And they come away from their experience with a greater appreciation for free enterprise, intellectual rigor, and the competition of ideas, and an approach to policy and political discourse that is principled, humble, and compassionate. And I think that's a really big thing. Second, and related to that, in a confusing time and changing political and social climate, Values and Capitalism is promoting faithful yet pragmatic Christian engagement in a pluralistic public square. To put that in another way, because those were a lot of big words, we're giving a broad network of Christians a space and framework through which to engage in political discourse and public life that is principled without being overly ideological or partisan. We do this primarily in our engagement with young people, but the initiative also seeks to do this with faculty and professionals, including many of you here who are a part of our Ideas Council. So that's second. Third, more and more talented Christian college students are pursuing jobs and careers in DC as a result of our programs. This is real and pretty personal for me because I went to Westmont College, a small Christian college in Santa Barbara, California. When I graduated in 2012, there was maybe one other person who came to DC. I pretty much know alumni who are in the DC area. And now there's a pretty rich network of Westmont alums who are in DC working here, doing various jobs, and a lot of them came through our programs. Of course, all this to say, not all students can or should move to DC. I want to emphasize that. But it is a place where Christians can use their influence to do significant good through government, nonprofits, businesses, and more. We need faithful people in this city, and many of these students did not have the awareness or the ability to come here before our programs existed. Related to this, when these students move to DC, they immediately have Christian community through the relationships that they formed in our programs. These relationships are absolutely critical in grounding them and supporting them as they begin life in a city like this. Probably one of the most rewarding times of my tenure at AEI and with the Values and Capitalism Initiative was when Ariana and Johnny got engaged, and they recently got married, so applause for that. They're probably embarrassed now. First thing to mention is that they apparently met at an Arthur Brooks dinner, so there you go. Arthur Brooks, love your enemies and your future spouse. But when they got engaged, they had an engagement party. I went to it. I looked around at the room, and I think about 60% of the people there had come through our programs in one form or another. And I was like, man, this is what it's all about. Christian community, people pursuing the good through their vocations and doing it in community, supporting each other. So that's really what we're all about. And then fourth and finally, we've built a tight-knit community of Christian college professors who have become good friends and are invested in our mission. I think we have one of them here, Stephen, representative. A great deal of fruit has resulted from these relationships. They've allowed us to reach top students and given us a sustained presence on campuses. Various collaborations have popped up amongst them, including a study abroad trip to the UK to study the history of markets, as well as a cover page article in Christianity Today. They've landed new positions through relationships formed in our network. It's what we call cherry picking, which is endorsed by Values and Capitalism, though not by their school administrators. And most importantly, they have challenged, encouraged, and supported each other in their careers and vocations. Ultimately, what this initiative is seeking is long-term cultural change, and we think that the investments that we have made in educators and future leaders over the past 10 years have the potential to make real change come to pass. So this is ultimately why we're here celebrating 10 years today. But we're also here to start a new chapter in the history of the program. I'll say more in a few minutes, but first I'd like to play a brand new video so you can hear from some alumni and partners of our program rather than just me. So if Sean and Sammy could hit play.
Students need to understand that their faith matters in the public square. That we live in a culture right now that sometimes suggests that's not the case. But in fact, people are hungry for new solutions. They're hungry for people to help them think about what is the good? How do we pursue the good together?
Students have a lot of these deep questions about how faith and public life intersect, but maybe not a lot of people to talk to about them.
I had some exposure, but it was usually just to sound bites.
And I remember walking to class really thinking deeply, like, can you be a Christian in politics?
I think it's hard to understand how your faith fits in with the broader things that are going on in the world and how you can be a part of that.
What do we do in a world where not everyone is on the same page faith-wise?
AEI's Values and Capitalism Initiative, which was founded in 2009, exists to engage with Christian college students and help them connect the principles and convictions of their faith with how they should engage in public life.
After coming to that first conference that AEI had and kind of engaging with some of those speakers and some of those debates that they had, completely shifted my interest.
AEI's initiative taught me that it's important to think about your faith in the context of every single day of the week, not just on Sunday. And what that means is integrating the way you think about your faith into every decision you make, especially at the workplace.
To give college students an opportunity to step back from just like the day-to-day of sitting in class and learning and think about like integrating the whole is really important.
It gives them a space to be able to work through their thoughts and become much more intelligible leaders about the topics and issues that they care most about.
We go out into the world and engage in these conversations we really care about and are able to bring our faith and our values and our morals into these conversations.
We're shaping and training leaders. We're introducing young men and women to new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of bringing their faith to bear in politics.
And so for me, it inspired the framework that I use to look at my career in finance. When you're financing projects, what impact does that have on people and their communities?
It kind of helped answer some of those questions on the empowerment that can come from work and from entrepreneurship. And so it helped me seek a career in politics and more specifically looking at policy that will empower entrepreneurs.
I grew up in agriculture, and my plan was always to go back to the farm. But through friends at AEI, really learning God calls individuals specifically to come to DC, to be a part of what he is doing in this city.
So after 10 years, we're really excited to be re-envisioning the program and relaunching it as AEI's initiative on faith and public life. Our core programs aren't going to change, our core mission is not going to change, but we feel like this better reflects what our program has become and what it needs to be in the coming decade.
To me, one of the greatest aspects of the American Enterprise Institute is the initiative on faith and public life, because we need people of faith involved in public life. Only in that way will we be able to guide public life in a direction that'll make our country stronger.
There are very few places for Christian students to think about how their faith applies to contemporary politics, and AEI's initiative is a central place to do this.
Been one of the best parts of my experience in college.
Most transformative experiences for my undergraduate career.
Part of who I am today, I am because of the initiative.
Now is the time for Christians to be able to articulate their conception of where this country is headed, what the common good is, and how faith can help serve that. And so I'm excited that our students, that faculty have the opportunity to think about that as a part of the initiative on faith and public life.
I have immense hope and faith in just the future of this country from seeing so many brilliant young people and minds who are willing to engage in these difficult conversations and just be able to show the heart and love of Christ in the spaces that they are working in.
Well, thanks to Ryan Patch for putting that together, and thanks to a handful of people who are here who are featured in that little video. I think that really tells some of the story of what this initiative is all about and some of the people that have been an important part of it. And so yes, after a great 10 years under the banner of Values and Capitalism, we are pleased to announce that Values and Capitalism will now be known as AEI's Initiative on Faith and Public Life. We wanted you, our closest partners, to know first, but we'll be making a public announcement and unveiling a brand new website in early October. Why make this change? Well, in part because we feel that this name more accurately just embodies the core purpose of our initiative, to equip Christians for thoughtful engagement in public life. It's also more reflective of how we aim to accomplish that mission through open-minded, nonpartisan dialogue in the pursuit of truth. To be clear, our program will continue to champion the core tenets of a free and virtuous society. Yes, we're still big fans of both values and capitalism, but we have always done that and will continue to do that with intellectual humility, authenticity, and seriousness. We think that this new name better expresses that ethos and will allow our program to have a broader reach and form more strategic partnerships in the years ahead. And what will the coming decade bring for this program? Well, there's a renewed debate about how Christians ought to be engaged in the public square, if at all. We want the initiative on faith and public life to be right in the middle of those conversations. And we have a few things that we think we want to contribute to that conversation. We think it's imperative, not optional, for Christians to be engaged in public life. From Jeremiah 29 to the greatest commandments to the Great Commission, we are called to be deeply concerned about the world and the people around us. And working in politics and policy isn't the only way to pursue that calling, of course. It could also mean running a business in a way that seeks the good of others, financing the development of a product that will improve lives, or investing your time or resources in the good of your local community. This calling also drives us to do this work wisely with a knowledge of how the world works, economics, and which conditions and institutions are most conducive to personal and societal flourishing. And finally, it means for us personally that we must be sensitive to the gifts, talents, and interests that we have been given and how they can be used for the glory of God and the good of our neighbors. This, ultimately, is what the Initiative on Faith and Public Life is primarily in the business of doing, helping Christians along in their pursuit of faithful and effective public life. In the new logo, you'll notice that there are 4 arrows that are converging in on each other. This is meant to signify a meeting place, a conversation, a public square. A big part of our mission and the work that we do is convening people for conversations about important topics, which is what we're going to transition to now. I'm grateful to have 3 friends and partners with us today who are each doing their own remarkable work at the intersection of faith and public life, and I'm going to invite them up on stage now for a discussion on how Christians can engage faithfully in politics and public life in 2019 and beyond. So if Cherie, Michael, and Stephanie would join me. All right, well, welcome. Thank you for being here. When we were thinking of who to involve in this event, these three people came to mind for a variety of reasons. One, they become friends and partners of this program. Two, they're really intellectuals in their own right and have a lot to say personally about these topics. And three, they really are leading remarkable initiatives that are trying to help Christians think about public life. And so I'm really grateful that you would take a few hours to be with us today. So quick introductions for them. Cherie Harder serves as the president of the Trinity Forum. She previously served in the White House as special assistant to the president and director of policy and projects for First Lady Laura Bush. Earlier in her career, she served as policy advisor to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. From 2001 to 2005, she was the senior counselor to the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, where she helped the chairman design and launch the We the People initiative, which I participated in. I don't know if you knew that, to enhance the teaching, study, and understanding of American history. Prior to that, Cherie was the policy director for Senator Sam Brownback and also served as deputy policy director at Empower America. Her ghostwritten speeches and articles have appeared in Vital Speeches of the Day, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, and others. To her left is Michael Ware, who serves as chief strategist and a member of the executive team for the AND campaign. Previously, Michael directed faith outreach for President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign and was one of the youngest White House staffers in modern American history. He served in the White House faith-based initiative during President Obama's first term, where he led evangelical outreach and helped manage the White House's engagement on religious and values issues, including adoption and anti-human trafficking efforts. Michael is also the founder of Public Square Strategies and the author of Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House about the Future of Faith in America. He's written for The Atlantic, Christianity Today, USA Today, Relevant Magazine, and other publications on faith, politics, and culture. And I should mention that he's also a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. And finally, to my immediate right is Stephanie Summers, who is the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. She is co-author with Michael Gerson and Katie Thompson of Unleashing Opportunity, Why Escaping Poverty Requires a Shared Vision of Justice. She's also contributed a chapter to the edited volume, The Church's Social Responsibility. And she's written for other publications, including Comment and Q Ideas. Stephanie is an award recipient of the first ever Duke Divinity Reflective Leadership Grant, which she was just telling about, which sounds amazing, and serves on several faith-based nonprofit advisory boards. Prior to her appointment at CPJ, she spent 12 years with the CCO doing on-campus ministry, where her roles included vice president for the Eastern region and vice president for organizational development. She began her career in nonprofit administration as executive director of the Open Door, a church-based youth center in Pittsburgh. So thanks for joining me. Really excited for this conversation. And so to start, I wonder if we could just define terms a little bit. And maybe, Stephanie, you could start, because I feel like you can maybe bring a Kuyperian approach to this. What is public life?
Yes.
What is politics? How do we define that?
Yeah, so I'll start with public life. So you have to think about it a little bit like there's multiple publics. So when you think about how we approach, the most basic elements, there are a people, there is a community that those people share, and then there are multiple communities that people share. So let me give you examples of what it's not. The public, when we speak to the public, right, it's not church, right? It's not your family, right? Public issues of public concern or public life are not like, what my husband and I talked about. We were having dinner last night. And it's not matters of church ecclesiology, right? These are matters that are of public concern, but can be at really different levels of public concern. So a local school, a neighborhood, right? Or a nation. So the public we're talking to is a nation. And unlike maybe your family or unlike a church where there's some shared set of values, the public in these highly differentiated frameworks, right, are not all in agreement about the definition of the good. They're not all in agreement that religion is good. They certainly don't all share the same religious beliefs. And if they are animated by faith, they may have deep disagreements, even if they're animated by the same faith tradition. And so things that are in public life presume you are speaking in such a way that is bringing who you are into that conversation, but into a conversation at many different levels with many different institutions to try to contend respectfully for the good with people who think like you and people who don't at all think like you.
Mm-hmm. What'd she get wrong?
Nothing, as usual. Stephanie just came off like a 6-month sabbatical, and so she's developed really deep thinking.
She spent 6 months preparing for these.
Yeah, exactly. And so she's going to be the most grounded, perhaps. Just the one thing I'd add is, I think part of what is so disorienting about this era that we're in now is that the public has a way of making everything public, and so we find ourselves, particularly as Christians, in a place where what seem to be private or seem to be internal, seem to be a matter of ecclesiology, to be matters of public interest, and I think Christians have a difficult time of transitioning when that is the case. So I think everything Stephanie laid out is right. I think part of what's so disorienting about this time is those categories have a way of being broken down in ways that we need to be able to navigate effectively.
Nothing to add. Great point.
Great. So if this is what public life is, what is the goal of Christian public life? Maybe especially at the highest level of engaging in a pluralistic society. What are we there for? Is it to bring about Christendom? Is it to bunker down and protect our communities? Is it somewhere in the middle, which I'm guessing you might say? What's the goal of Christian public life? Cherie,
Sure.
How about you?
Well, there's so many ways to answer that question. Some of the two basic goals of Christian public engagement. One is to promote justice. And related to that very closely is better loving one's neighbor. And there's a public aspect to that as well, of course, as a personal and a private aspect. It matters a great deal whether government is, civil administration is competent. It matters whether the ambulance comes. It matters whether corruption is rife or the government can basically be trusted to do the right things. It matters if there is a carved out area for freedom of speech and expression and religious expression and worship and public practice of religion. All these things matters a great deal in terms of human flourishing, in terms of the realization of justice. And so part of the goal of public engagement is to promote justice, to lead to human flourishing. I'm sure there's a lot one can flesh out with that, but it can be more, but that part is essential.
Yeah, I'm working on a report now that'll come out at the beginning of the year on Christianity and pluralism. And my partner is Amy Black, who was just featured in the video you showed, and I know is close with the program here, and we're excited about it, but not much about the report is public at this point, but and the report's hosted by the Trinity Forum, so this is a very, so it's all in the family here. And so, not much about the report is public yet, but it's an interview-based report. So we've interviewed about 50 Christian leaders, really spanning the theological and political spectrum. And one thing that stuck out to me is, again, across the spectrum, how many of the leaders are on the same page that Christian political and public engagement is about loving and glorifying God and loving neighbor. Now, obviously, when they drill down into the details of what does that require, it's very different. There are great differences. But I've been encouraged that, for all of the talk of sort of secularization, for all of the talk about Christian division, that we share this common language, that there really is a root to Christianity that, 2,000 years later can't be ignored, that is still a foundation to build on. And I think it's a foundation to build on not just among self-identifying Christians, but something on which to build a public discourse. So I don't have much that, at the AND campaign, we view politics as an essential forum, so not the essential forum, not the only forum, but an essential forum for loving our neighbor. I'll just add what that, right, it's important to say what it's not. If politics is about glorifying God and loving neighbor, what it's not is about how do I pursue the maximal accumulation of power to effectuate whatever ideology I happen to have. It's not a forum for self-aggrandizement. It's other-centered. Our political engagement ought to be other-centered. And so it's important to also state explicitly what it's not, because what often happens in faith-based political engagement is sort of the rhetoric is all, I'm here just doing the Father's work, and then what gets shepherded through that is a whole lot of corruption and deceit and manipulation, and we need to be explicit about those things.
One word that comes up a lot in this conversation is the common good. I wonder if similarly you could maybe define like what is the common good? Is it just an aggregate of goods and we're kind of getting a big pie, or is there a deeper, a little bit more philosophical, meaningful understanding of it? Because I think we all agree that we should pursue the common good, but what does that actually mean? What does that look like?
Stephanie's really good at definitions.
No, so as the English major, I don't want to be the definer for the group. It would be, look, I'll add on. When do you start? You're going to have to flip a coin. We were joking about this earlier, how funny this panel is going to be, because we all really like each other, and it's like, do enough of these that we all really know like things other people will say, which is why Cherie can say, I'm going to be the group's definer. But I don't want to be. I want to hear what your answers to this.
One thing I will say, that which is a little bit of a tangent, but it will relate, is the role of means as well as ends in terms of the public good and in promoting justice. In that, we often tend to think of it as this one goal, this one telos that it encapsulates the good, and if we can only reach it by any means necessary, it will be achieved. And I think really some of the results of the last few years have shown some of the folly of that the common good encompasses means as well as ends in its realization. Václav Havel once said, I'm going to completely mangle his quote, but and he said this in a crucible of leadership himself when he was trying to basically figure out what the new constitution of Czechoslovakia was, and was urged by lots of people to essentially be more authoritarian, crack some more eggs, throw some more elbows, get what needs to be done. And he said, really the only way I know how to bring about a just, decent, humane social order is justly, decently, and humanely. And that if we don't do that, our very methods will contradict our ends, and they'll never be achieved. So I think the common good involves not only the pursuit of a telos that benefits us all, that involves a pursuit of what is just and good and right and public virtue, but also necessarily encompasses the means through which we do that.
Mic drop.
Nobody else, okay. Echoing something that you said, Michael, and bringing it down a little bit more to the personal level, I think it can be really easy in these times for us to either be overly cynical about, man, it's awful, I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, or kind of overly naive and optimistic about what we can achieve through politics and public life. Could any of you, maybe especially the two of you who worked in politics directly, talk about how do you balance that? You don't want to come to work cynical because no good has ever been done, I think. I don't know, you can correct me in this, has been done by cynical people, but at the same time, if you're overly optimistic and naive, you're going to put too many eggs in that basket and probably do things that are unwise and unpragmatic.
I'll take a quick stab. I'd like to hear Stephanie on this too, because goodness knows colleges have their own set of vicious politics, so there's a lot to be added there. I think there's a big difference between optimism and hope, in that if what you are really resting on is your optimism in achieving a certain end, you're probably going to be doomed to fairly regular and profound disappointment. In that, rarely in politics, or really in almost any aspect of public life, do you achieve total victory and have that victory last. Almost every victory is provisional and temporary and often overturned. Defeats are also rarely permanent. There's no unmixed goods in the city of man. There's very few perfect solutions in public administration. So a lot of it is like kind of where you put your hope. And if you put your hope in achieving that objective, it's going to be a disappointing ride. If ultimately, and this may sound a little bit cliched and holy, but ultimately if your hope is in the author of it all, and in his goodness and in his long-term plan, you just have a very different basis for how you do the work that you do, knowing that you're ultimately called to be faithful in difficult times, in defeat as well as victory, amid setbacks as well as progress, as opposed to successful. And it doesn't all rest on you.
I think that's so important. I think of it as, you want to have a direction. It's important to develop your own ideas about what's good for people and what's good in our politics. And it's important to hold that view loosely, to have a humility about that view. And often it's when you either trend too far towards sort of aimlessness and sort of a sense of futility, or you trend towards what Cherie spoke to earlier, which is this idea that sort of you found the Holy Grail, you found the exact right sort of technocratic mix that will lead the country where it needs to go, that people run into problems because you're always going to, that's always going to lead to disappointment. Mm-hmm. And so I've found, one thing I've been thinking a lot about over the last several years are what are sort of spiritual disciplines for the public. And I think it's here on this question of hope that's a critical question. So what kind of habits can you build up that will both keep you in the fight over the long term and keep you engaged in these very important issues, but in a way that that keeps you grounded, that doesn't lead to you being subsumed by many of the idols that are in this city and in our politics generally that are trying to claim you. I think some of those things could be as important as having a group of people around you that are faithful yet hold different sort of political ends in mind. I think that's a critical thing. So I tell a story in my book when I was offered the job to run faith outreach for the president's reelect, for President Obama's reelect. I asked 6 Republican friends to join me on a weekly call where I asked them to hold me accountable on some personal things. I had just been married for about 8 months, so it was very early in my marriage. So I asked these guys to make sure that I was being a good husband and that kind of thing. But then there were some things related to my job. One of them was I had seen, and a lot of my sort of public formation was in reaction to and response to a kind of political bullying related to faith that suggests that like the easiest thing to do when you're doing faith outreach on behalf of a candidate is to say, if you're a real Christian, you'll vote for my person. If you're a real person of faith, you'll support. That's like the easiest thing to do. It's also tremendously manipulative and places a moral and religious burden on people that is soul crushing. So I asked my 6 Republican friends, I said, I don't control everything that comes out of this campaign, but if you ever see anything that comes out of my shop that suggests that my candidate is the person for Christians, I want you to call me out on that. That was important. I thought it was publicly important, but for my own spirit, it was important that being around and being in an office of people who they're working 18 hours a day to elect a man, that I wasn't being sucked into that sort of spirit that was sort of over-determinative on the effects of an election.
I'll say one thing. I do think that, there's a question almost of who you keep company with that I actually think is really important here. I don't expect people who don't know Christ to not be cynical. So it's unsurprising, and I don't take offense when they are offensive towards me, because I don't expect them to share hope that I have. I want them to, and I hope that all of my engagement with them is helping set an example for what it is like to live free in Christ. But I don't have a false expectation that we will enter in and somehow be guarded against the kind of cynical influence of folks who we're working with. However, there are also many Christians who have kind of become sucked into the blood sport of some of this. Right. In the same way that, I grew up in Pittsburgh, in the same way that some people love the Steelers in a way that is idolatry, right? And I say that as a fan, please don't hurt me. But, so the reality there is, like, what is our responsibility as we engage those folks? Because it's easy to just be a person that says, oh gosh, this person's taking this too seriously, or man, they're just like off, in their own little world, where really we need to contend for the soul of our brother or sister, to say, you know what, you've got this in the wrong place, right? Because their cynicism as a representative of Christ is like a horrible disease that is going to continue to transmit and actually represent a vision of who Christ is actually not, right? The other side of this is, I think it's very easy in this work, and this is true in every political coalition that we're part of, to forget to include in the discussion the very people who you are hoping lives will be bettered by the work that you're doing. So it's in kind of the parlance of the day, this is new since I went to college, right? It's otherizing people, but essentially it's like those people don't have a voice at the table, but they need to. And part of that is to remind us of the hope that's there, particularly with Christians who are on the margins for a variety of reasons, religion, socioeconomic status, immigration status, etc. Those folks actually are suffering when we are trying to change the nature of their suffering. Their suffering is actually an identification with Christ, right? So their framework that they bring is one of hope, because, hey, they've got some long shots out here, right? Everything's a Hail Mary pass for them, right? However, that's not how, forgive if you're not raised in a white evangelical church, and please forgive if you are and you're going to be offended by what I say. I say that as a white evangelical. The white evangelical church has taught people to cope with suffering, not find hope in suffering and identification with Christ. But this actually really, really matters if we're going to be people who aren't just like pie-in-the-sky optimists or have overly invested vision in what we're going to be able to achieve, either with our means or the kind of the ends that we seek. When we're kind of lost in that place of just kind of the technical solution. And I think this is actually just a thing that I see more and more in young evangelicals that has sort of been cultivated. And it's something that I think is pretty dangerous for our public engagement. So figuring out ways to keep people in the center in the conversation who are people whose suffering still holds up the hope of kind of the ultimate, I think is really important.
So Michael, the AND campaign is really focused on making sure that Christians are putting the convictions of their faith before political ideology, before party line. I guess, why is that so important? And at the same time, how do we still work through the institutions that we have in a way that makes us effective leaders?
Well, because the whole system is built to isolate people who don't play along. And so one of the things we identified is that you're taking a risk of stepping out and to make people not feel so alone in doing that. So a big part of what the AND campaign is trying to do is to provide a vehicle for faithful Christian political engagement that's really in the fray. I mean, there are why I love this program so much, why I love the work that Trinity Forum and Center for Public Justice are doing. Sometimes people who share a common analysis of everything that we've talked about in the last half hour, their solution is, well, if we just teach or promote certain principles, then we'll like reset the culture and like people will get, so like be civil, be nice, like politics isn't ultimate. Those are all very important things. If they're not embodied in the actual issues of the day and in the actual practice of politics, then I think most of the world, including many Christians who are, especially young Christians who are just asking, how can I be involved in justice and not compromise my faith? People look at like a principled only approach and say, well, that's not even approaching where the rubber meets the road. Like yes, everyone can be civil in theory. The question is when to be civil when it's your rights at stake. The question is when to be civil when you're in the middle of an advocacy campaign and all of your metrics show that if you just spike your numbers a bit by maybe trying this tactic or the other, then you could reach your end. When it becomes really practical, then it's when the principles matter. And so that's a big part of what the AND campaign is trying to do, to be in the fray, to be willing to take some losses and to actually display the decisions that we've made that we know aren't the most politically effective, but are sort of the outflow of faithfulness. And of course we do that imperfectly. You could check my Twitter timeline to spot some of those imperfections. But we hope that by being in the fray, and it's one of the reasons why I appreciate Ben Sass, which is it's important to have one senator, and maybe there are others, I haven't heard too many others. It's important to have a senator out of 100 who's clearly decided politics is important enough for him to dedicate at least this portion of his career to it, and yet willing to say that politics isn't ultimate. I mean, traditionally, whatever vocation you find yourself in, even if you're like a pastor, right? Like the temptation is to say, what I'm doing is the ultimate, that's why I chose it. But for someone like Ben Sass to especially as someone who identifies as Christian and holds himself out in that way, to be able to say, I've decided this is important enough to dedicate my life and career with some risk and some sacrifice, and yet I don't think it's worth everything. Like I don't think it's worth sacrificing faithfulness. Is an important message in this time. It's one that we try and send at the AND campaign.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you talked about this a little bit already, but I'd love to hear if you want to add more, or from Cherie too. For a person, an individual thinking about getting involved in politics, especially maybe at the federal level, how did you go about thinking about the opportunities that provides, and why maybe having that place of influence could be really valuable and a good thing? So maybe your thought process about that, but also what were some of the things that you're kind of wary of, or how did you stay grounded in the day-to-day? You talked about this a little bit, Michael, but maybe Cherie could start and then you could add.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I certainly didn't do it perfectly. But I think two big things that are really important in terms of staying grounded in the day-to-day have actually been alluded to before. And one is just the importance of friendship, the importance of having other friends in the faith that you can be transparent with, that you can talk with. I think it's essential just in terms of kind of just keeping touch with what is real and true, amidst the swirl of things. Yeah. I think it's vital to keeping your courage. When people who you may think highly of are very critical of you, it can be disorienting. And a lot of what politics is basically serving as a human pincushion and just kind of absorbing a lot of negativity coming at you. And friendship is just really vital, I think, in terms of keeping one's sense of what is real and true and valuable and good. Another thing which is related, which again sounds really hokey, but is get involved in a church.
That's what yes, 100%.
It's so important, and and even politically as well. Tyler, one of your colleagues, Tim Carney, recently wrote a book called Alienated America, which we hosted him along with Ann Snyder Brooks. But one of the very interesting points sort of buried in his book that I thought was quite telling for Christians who are involved in politics is that when you surveyed self-reported evangelicals about their attitudes, the self-reported evangelicals who did not go to church tended to have the harshest views towards people who were not like them. And that changed dramatically when you looked at people who actually went to church, who were often the people most likely to be involved in actively loving your neighbor. We have certainly seen a lot of examples and the sad evidence of people essentially not just instrumentalizing, but often weaponizing their faith. And when your faith becomes a tribal label rather than a creedal and embodied expression, I think all sorts of damage can result. So those are two things.
I can't say, and actually it's not hokey, it's the most important. Whenever I meet with students who are coming to DC for college or recent graduates, don't put off the decision to find a local church for 6 months. By then, frankly, it'll be like too late. I mean, I've just seen it so much. Coming to the city, people come here for all of the right reasons, and then they end up working for, many of them, for Christian organizations, and they're talking about their faith in their work, and their faith sort of becomes their work, and whenever the transition happens, they suddenly find themselves not going to church anymore, not really practicing any spiritual disciplines related to their faith, but still doing the same work and losing the root of it. Finding a local church is imperative for everything Cherie said. I'd add, the church is a reminder that politics is not ultimate. I worship every single week with people with vastly different political views than I do. Vastly different political views than I do. With very different backgrounds. And that will ground you when in the work week, again, you're constantly being pulled to view people as political enemies or hurdles or obstacles and not as children of God, and certainly not as fellow Christians. And so finding a local church is the most important thing you could do. And I'd say don't think that you could substitute a network of friends who are Christians, that you, especially if they're not in this city. I'm 31, and so I'm of the generation where it's like we're all spread out and we'll text each other and check up. That's not going to be enough to sustain you in this work.
Stephanie.
Okay. Yep. Amen.
Okay, but Stephanie, putting you on the spot now. You've done a lot of work throughout your life with young people, and it seems like to an extent each generation has a little bit of a different brand of how they go about politics and how they think about political life. What, maybe starting with you, but if anybody else wants to add, what do you see from millennials and Gen Z in terms of their approach, in terms of millennial and Gen Z Christians and their approach to politics and public life? Does it make you hopeful? Does it make you worried? What do you see from kind of the younger generations right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I see that I think is a real distinctive, and it is sort of a opportunity, but also a potential real challenge, is this like high value on tolerance. So that could be so good if it's thick. I'll explain these terms in a second. So bad if it's thin, right? So if we're people who are having a conversation here today about what does it mean to be a Christian that engages in a pluralistic society, thick pluralism means we are willing to say things. Now, this is not a public statement that you make all the time. This is not something you use in every context. But you say, we make truth claims that actually don't agree with each other, with people who don't share our faith, about things like what happens to people after they die. we have ultimate claims, and that we're willing to be people who sort of stand for those. We're willing to stand for particular claims around the value of a human person. In order to be tolerant, you actually have to talk about where you are, and invite tolerance. Now, there's so many crap examples of this, forgive, that I hesitate to even put it out here because I think, but it's so important because the thin tolerance is the can't we just all get along, right? The harmony that doesn't hold both our brothers and sisters to account, but also doesn't work with people who don't agree with us to say, can't we figure out a way that we cannot clobber each other over our differences in court as the only way we can solve our problems, or, which are super narrow decisions that only apply to a little thing until it works its way up, making life untenable for whole swaths of our citizenry on all kinds of issues. Pick tons of things you care about right now, foster and adoption services, right? The ability of faith-based organizations to hire exclusively on the basis of religion, right? I actually want a co-religionist to work on my staff, right? There's all these things. How we solve, lots of questions related to LGBT identity and religious freedom. But in order to do that, we actually have to be people who are willing to say, this is where I'm coming from. Where are you coming from? That takes work, and is work that's really hard to do because you actually have to do the work of developing relationships with people. One of the things that I am hopeful about the Gen Y, Gen Z, is you like people, for the most part, and you want to be in relationship with people for the most part. So there's this longing for harmony and tolerance, let's not make it messy, but I do want to be around people, right? So there's the potential for this engagement there if you're willing to take risks, upset the harmony a little bit. I'll say this, there are folks who have spent their entire career in Congress who took all kinds of stands against their party for all kinds of things. These are all lost to history for half this room, I'm sure, age-wise, but these are folks who were respected by people who disagreed with them so strongly, but they stood for something, and they didn't stand for it in an offensive way. They stood for it in a way that was an invitation to do better work together. We're going to have to be people who go there in a pluralistic society. So the crud place would be, hey, we're going to go there by not saying anything, by keeping the peace. That's thin. Don't go there. Go thick. This is why. So that may actually require you have to do more work to know what you believe. So when I say, that I believe particular things because I believe all human beings are created in God's image, I actually have to make that intelligible to the public who doesn't know what I mean when I use that coded language, right? I have to actually explain it. It doesn't mean they have to agree with it, right? But at least they know where I'm coming from. And I've actually found that these types of level-setting conversations are welcomed by people who are actually afraid of us. They're afraid of Christian political engagement as being zero-sum, and way, way willing to give the Christian faith a lot more both room to be part of the solutions to problems and part of kind of public engagement, but also way more willing to talk about where they're at as people who are somewhere on a spiritual journey, right? To say, I was rejected by my parents because, of their faith when I told them I was fill in the blank, right? These types of things are game changers. I think you can do it because you want to love your neighbor, but it's going to require skill and choices to do a little bit more work rather than some of the things that are just easier and require less work. Sorry.
No, that's a great answer. I just say one of the problems, there are so many ways for this generation to get immediate affirmation for actions that they take, and to take credit for actions. So our generation is, and the next generation, incredibly justice-oriented, entrepreneurial. Politics often doesn't work in the way of direct inputs and outputs, which is, I think, a significant barrier for young people that they need to get over if they're really going to effectively pursue the justice they want to see in the world. So, so much of politics is about putting everything that you have towards, influencing the situation, and not knowing if it was your action that tipped the scales or millions of others, and being okay with that. And so I do think I'm hopeful about the next generation. I do think that there's a public-mindedness that has been lacking for a long time, but I'm worried that so much of that is going to be wasted with energy that isn't institutionalized and that is individualized to the extent that politics is about willing to put your voice behind voices and efforts that don't 100% represent exactly the way you'd go about things. And there's an individualism among young people that that is uncomfortable with that, but which leads to splintered sort of advocacy that makes it very hard to get somewhere.
I'll just add on two, I guess, fairly disparate points. One thing that I think new generations are just perhaps so much better at is an ability to navigate and kind of live with others across difference. It just you encounter it all the time. It's not new. It doesn't take you aback. I'm dating myself. When I graduated, almost all positions of authority were kind of held more by boomer men. Within evangelicalism, there was a whole kind of layer that seemed kind of patronizing, paternalistic, with women who were in the sphere, and that seems to have dissipated, and certainly among your generation, which is a great thing. One thing I'll just throw out there that is, I think everyone in this room who is, millennial or younger has basically kind of grown up as a digital native. Has not really been an adult at a time when, these devices weren't almost surgically attached, to your hand. And so, almost like a fish doesn't know it's wet, it's hard to imagine kind of life without it. And I think every so often it's a really helpful thing to take a Sabbath or what have you, or make a deliberate attempt to read as often as one scans text, posts, and the like, in that it really does predispose one to think in different ways. Not only about different content, which it definitely does, but just to think in different ways. It's an old insight, Marshall McLuhan, that the medium is the message. The way that we get our information does bias us towards the way we receive it and the way it wires us towards responding. So when so much of our politics is online, and we think we've done something really noble and brave by liking or retweeting or sending another posting with a witty snark attack, really it doesn't matter at all. And when you actually look,
unless it's my tweet,
unless it's your tweet,
unless it's my tweets, yeah.
And when you look at even civic participation rates, and this has been true for almost every generation, younger people are less likely to vote. Somehow there is a sense that sending that tweet is more important than showing up to the polls, and that is not the case. But even just in terms of the way one thinks about the world, you will view things differently because reading requires more analysis, more linear thinking, more context, more background. It predisposes you to try to find the logic flaws. Reading stories necessarily engages your imagination and your empathy. And there's all sorts of studies showing that essentially the more you read and the more you write, the more likely you are to have friends, to give, to vote, to volunteer, and to be involved in your community. And the more time spent with electronic media, it's exactly the worse. The less likely you are to be involved with the community, to vote, to volunteer, or to give as well. So one, I think, just encouragement is pay deliberate attention to the way that you get your information and the way you think, because it has a power that when it's ignored is when perhaps it's the most insidious and powerful.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to you all after one more question. So if you guys could get ready with the mics, that'd be great. So Alistair McIntyre has pointed to Saint Benedict as a model for Christian engagement in this secular age. Who would you point to? I think it's incredibly important for us to learn from the lives and actions of great church saints and heroes, of people from history who have been heroic and courageous. Who would be a model for each of you in thinking through how does a Christian engage in public life today?
So this is basically a cliche, but I think he's a great model. William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, are a great model to look at. It's not that they were perfect; they certainly weren't. They were much more, I guess, forward-leaning, perhaps, than the Benedict community, which tended to, literally retreat. Wilberforce was a member of Parliament, but more than that, the Clapham sect was essentially a group of friends, who lived in a neighborhood together, and most of them had different day jobs, and especially for the times were kind of a remarkably motley crew in that, English class system at the time was highly stratified, but there was a potter, there were widows involved, and it was kind of this just sort of amazing community of people with all sorts of different identities, but also intellects, activists, creatives, and the like, who kind of thought, dreamed, and schemed together. And again, weren't perfect and had their setbacks, but also created something really remarkable. I mean, most of you will know the story of Wilberforce, but at the time that he was in Parliament, the French Revolution is going on, and the very conditions that made the French Revolution possible were also largely true for England as well. It was a violent, highly stratified, debauched, a very inequitable society with a lot of poverty, a lot of debasement, and a lot of violence. And at the end of his term, he essentially helped usher in a radically different society with plenty of flaws, but a radically different one that had more concern for the poor, far more of a robust civil society, and unlike the United States, actually overturned the slave trade without a civil war, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. So I think it's a great example of someone, Wilberforce gets all the attention. He was the guy in Parliament. But really, it was the circle of friends with him that made all of that work possible and spread it much more broadly as well as deeply culturally.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many examples. Think of Dorothy Day, think of King and Thurman. I think the point people underestimate and underappreciate the number of people in this city who are acting faithfully right now, and including the folks on to my left and my right. There are a lot of models to choose from. So we're not at any shortage of examples of faithfulness in public life. I do think that sometimes what they bring is not as appreciated because it's not as efficient. It's not as it doesn't garner the kind of attention. But one of the most helpful things that you could do is find mentors. Some of these folks are, Josh Good is a great example. Tiffany, there are John Carr. There are folks in the city that are doing faithful work. So yes, look to, but sometimes it can seem like, oh, well, that was such a different environment. Now we're in sort of a post-Christian whatever. Just to go back to a previous, and I've had this debate with Rod. So Rod Dreher is a friend. He wrote The Benedict Option. He pulls a great deal on Charles Taylor's work, And the point that Rod and I talk about back and forth a bit is that Taylor actually doesn't think that we're in a age, especially not in the American context, that's dominated by the secular. Taylor has this idea of contestation, which is actually the exact sort of the exact kind of moment when actually Christians being faithful in the public square is most valuable. In other words, it's when things are contested and not assumed, when there's some risk involved, when sort of being Christian in public isn't just about garnering social capital, but about spending it. It's in that moment when actually it's valuable, and there are many examples of folks doing that now. I'd add someone like Rich Mao and Mark Laverton. And there are so many examples. What you can do is study those models and think about what can I take from what this person has experienced, what this person is doing, and incorporate it into my life. I think of Mako and so many of the speakers that you have at the Trinity Forum. So yeah.
So I would be terribly remiss running a neo-Kuyperian think tank if I don't say Kuyper. So let me just say that for everyone who knows me. But so I was on this study leave with Duke Divinity School, and so I did spend some time attending less to political philosophy and more to scripture as part of the work that I was doing. And I was really struck by kind of the Apostle Paul in Acts, in his kind of journey as a Roman citizen, right? The word contending, I think, is a really helpful word. And contending with an intent to bless, but also not back down, right? Compromise where it was important to do so because of means questions or all these other pieces, but also be a person who said, I'm a citizen, right? These rights ought to be afforded to me. I think those pieces, and there's many other examples in Scripture, right? Where, the assumption of being in contested space is what's present, right? Daniel, Esther, all these. I think we would do well to maybe pay attention there and think about the lessons that we can learn.
Great. We have time for a few questions. Dan, if you could just say who you are and where you're from.
Dan Burns, Joint Economic Committee, views my own, on leave from the University of Dallas. So all of you have partisan leanings and you haven't talked much about them. I feel like all of you agree that people on both sides of the political aisle, that the country would be better if people on both sides of the political aisle were, doing more of the kind of Christian engagement in public life that y'all are talking about. So could each of you say something about how you think, from your point of view, both the left on the one hand and the right on the other would change? How would they look different if more Christians on each of those sides were doing their job properly? And leave out the sort of mythical median American voter and just talk about the kind of policy, intellectual, DC type of circles that go to think tank panels and do this sort of thing. Like how would each side look different if this were being done better?
I'll take one quick stab just to get us going. One thing that I'll back up a bit. Recently, I was on a panel where I was in a very clear and dramatic minority, in that everyone else on the panel was essentially talking about, America being rotten to the core and the Constitution needed to be thrown out, and just think, you hate to be the skunk at the garden party, but you think, well, here we go. And one of the things I was struck by at that gathering, which was a bunch of very smart people, who were, no one was hostile or antagonistic, there was a big difference of opinion, but was just how similar some of the rhetoric on the far left or the far right sounds. How much of it is apocalyptic, how much of it is oriented towards, if not now, all is lost. And I think one fairly dramatic thing that would change if there were more Christians, across the spectrum, is an understanding that, again, ultimately our hope is not in the political moment. Presumably our ultimate identity is not grounded in our partisan leanings, no matter how strongly they're held. But that also, all does not depend on this election. There's someone else who actually holds the future. And part of even just believing in the fall of man, is the recognition that all of us have a bent toward selfishness, which sometimes obscures our own view. And I think it would perhaps temper some of the rhetoric and some of the expectations of what politics could do.
I mean, I think that would have a major effect on the left, right? And is needed. I also think I think tending towards a thicker view of tolerance would be an effect of more Christian political engagement. I think a more grounded view of human nature would be helpful. I think we'd see a great number of changes, and I think that's a talk that I might have to write now. But I think we'd see the Democratic Party, in my view, because it's having a major debate right now about proceduralism and the extent to which norms are a barrier to the common good, to what we've been discussing here today. And at the very core of that, in my view, is what horizon are you operating under? So a more deeply grounded view of frankly, eschatology would change quite a bit on the left, and I think also on the right.
Eschatology might come up at the next debate. Just wait.
Yeah. Oh, Lord, I hope not.
Stephanie.
It might. We were talking before we came up here about a situation where, so we're working on a particular piece of legislation at the federal level. And we're working to gain co-sponsors across. And one of the things that's been unsurprising but discouraging has been, every member's response has, not every, close to every member's response has been, what does so-and-so think? And so-and-so is a different name, but it's all people who they're afraid of. I would like to think that would change, both in the sense that, I think Ben Sass walks around not really scared about getting voted out of office, right? And he might. I think, there's, this is not blanket advice. There is certainly time for not taking kind of the stand and, going down fighting kind of thing. But the norm has become just being afraid rather than thinking about what are we trying to do here? What's this for? As the thought horizon in which people are so on the, you would like to think someone would be responding on the merits of the legislation, right? As opposed to on, kind of the fear of getting punished, usually actually by their own party. Yeah, I think those things would change because I think, and I'm not sure this is only true of the Christian faith, but, if you have a belief in something ultimate that's not keeping your job as an elected official, and have a vision of what it is to serve in that capacity, right, which is not about keeping you in office, that might change. I would hope, because I think there's a lot less to fear if you kind of have the rightly oriented perspective on it.
Can I just add, and this is something I could elaborate on, but something, Steph, it's just a greater accountability to people who aren't going to vote for you. I think more than ever, we have members who their campaigns are governed by, and so therefore their actual governing is governed by the idea that they are most responsible for the coalition that backed them, and a deeper sense of Christian commitment to neighbor would overturn that. And I'd say it would overturn the way that Christians who aren't in elected office but who advocate. It would change how they advocate. They wouldn't just be sort of pursuing their line of argument, but actually be considering other points of view and even lifting up other points of view in pursuit of the common good.
Yeah.
John Carr.
Hi, my name is John Carr from Georgetown University. Thanks for including me. I think I brought up the average age a couple years just by being here. I came because I'm interested in the topic and I admire the panelists, but I wanted to support the work. AEI has been a great partner. And I know we had a lot in common, but I didn't know how much we had in common. I love your new name, Initiative on Faith in Public Life. The name of our structure is the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. So we're a little more modest, but we're in the same business. And I would argue that business is tougher than it's been in a long time. Washington is demoralized. Mike Gerson was mentioned, served in the Bush White House. I don't think he could serve in a Republican White House now. Mike is one of my heroes. I don't think you're going to be invited to serve in the next Democratic White House, which is a shame. I'm a Catholic.
I don't have the retainer that Gerson has, so if we could keep my career options as open as possible, I appreciate it.
Don't count on it. You got a baby. You need a job. My church is in crisis, but we still have something to say. But I would argue that a faithful Catholic who is pro-life, pro-family, pro-immigrant, an option for the poor, believes in religious liberty at home and abroad, could not be nominated for any major executive office, could not serve on any court that matters, and probably couldn't be appointed to any cabinet official. And so the shorthand for that is homeless. And we wear that sometimes as a badge of honor, but it's really a statement of failure. I work with the homeless. What we need is shelter. So how do we build a shelter in both political parties for people who focus on their faith instead of the partisan and ideological orthodoxies which are dominating this city?
Well, John, and we've discussed this quite a bit, you know, the sad truth is that the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of the people. And, you know, politicians and political parties are responding to the very incentives that the citizenry in general introduces. And so I think often you have people who, you know, we think about it's become popular over the last couple of years, in particular the graph with the 4 quadrants that basically shows, you know, the independent candidates running in this cycle are in the sort of fiscally conservative and socially liberal space, which is the least populated quadrant. The quadrant that is sort of most popular but least occupied is what you just described, basically. And yet it's unfilled. Well, a big part of the problem is that the folks in that quadrant hold those beliefs, but when it gets introduced into the political fray, and when the choice is, when they're choosing between sort of political options as characterized by their opponents, they sort of don't know how to hold on to their beliefs in a way that affects the political process. So a big part of changing this is what I discussed earlier, building institutions so that people don't feel alone, and that organizes those kinds of voters. Now, part of the problem is, in order to do that, you need to be able to build a coalition that's interracial, that it crosses class boundaries, and so there are all of these sorts of human sinful fractures that prevent that kind of coalition coming together. But we need to try to do that. And then I just think electoral reform is necessary. We need major reform in the area of political communications and techniques, and the great ability that political campaigns have to reach into the personal lives and psyche of the American voters. And I think we need to introduce, or at least think about, things like ranked choice voting that kind of open things up for voters who currently don't have politically viable options when they go to the ballot box, to be able to at least express their sort of closer to their ideal politics in a way that doesn't feel like obfuscation or a dereliction of their citizenry, their duty as citizens. But it's a very tough challenge. I think we have seen, John Bell Edwards in Louisiana comes closer to what you're talking about. I've been encouraged by sort of frankly, a lot of the work done here at AEI. I was with Abby McCloskey, and Abby's a close friend of Stephanie's, and the way that AEI has entered into a conversation like paid family leave is just very powerful. I think of sort of the Reformicon conversation more broadly, and then not to pander, but I've said to journalists and to reporters, and so I'm on the record in a forum that's not this, that Values in Capitalism was the most important initiative in conservative thought this century, in my view. To enter values and the idea that to the extent that capitalism does not align with our values, that's a discussion that has to be had, not just shove values to the side. That was a very important insistence that went above and beyond our sort of utilitarian approach to politics. And so we need institution building. I just add, we need funders who will fund that institution building. So much of the, it's not just, you can't just have the goodwill. You look at where all of the political energy is right now, and you look at you need money to build these institutions, and you need to be able to push back against the mischaracterizations and the manipulation that folks with moneyed interests and advocacy groups that claim to represent groups of people but actually don't represent those groups. And you could basically take any of the, look at DuPont Circle and look at the advocacy groups there and the positions they hold and the groups that they claim to represent while holding them, and there's vast disparity. And so we need to build institutions for these people so they could be represented.
And I think that funder piece is so important, particularly when it comes to thinking about people of faith and the institution building side, right? That's slow work, right? And the funder space is challenging in that, particularly when you're up against a presidential election, it becomes much more transactional about people of faith. So it's a very short time window in which you're basically being asked not to build an institution, but being asked to get some of those people for whatever purpose. And those are, integrity challenges for people who lead institutions, who basically are like, well, then thank you, we're not going to take your money, thanks for inviting us to apply for it. But I think the challenge is what we're talking about in the institution building side is not only we need people like you to invest there, we need people who are gonna put their dollars towards those things as well, so they can take root and thrive and recognize that that's not gonna change this necessarily in 2020 and suddenly we've rearranged the space and all of the things that you're heartbroken about have been fixed.
Just to double click on both of those, I think part of what's happened really for a couple of decades is Christians have underinvested institutionally in the cultural, in the spheres outside of the political. And then when our views are not represented, I think that's one of the many things fueling what Michael had talked about, whether you have more and more rhetoric that essentially somehow norm busting in pursuit of what you want is a good thing or a sign of strength or whatever it is.
Conviction.
Yeah. And I think in some ways we're reaping the underinvestment culturally that we've experienced over the last several decades.
So that's unfortunately going to have to be the last question, but I want to ask just one real quick thing. John mentioned shelter and the need for shelter, and our organizations, they're not big, but it is something. It is shelter for people to live faithfully in public life and figure out how to do that well. I wonder if you could each just spend 20 to 30 seconds talking a little bit about your organizations and ways that folks here might be able to get involved.
Yeah. So Katie Thompson is at that back table with. So Katie leads all our work with young adults. So if you're a young adult, please talk to Katie if you want follow up on anything I'm going to say right now. We have a set of resources called Political Discipleship. They're for small group study. And they help kind of orient you through all of the different pieces that we were talking about here today. So that is available to you. As well as several initiatives in sort of the public policy pieces that I was sort of dropping into the conversation today as well. And then we do internship programs here in DC. And we, unlike some internship programs, although nobody on this stage, but some internship programs, right, you're watering rubber plants. We actually have you do real work. And so we'd be happy to talk to you about that. Part of what we do within the context of our internships program is actually introduce you to comparative political philosophy. So we don't just teach kind of our own view, we teach it in tension with other views as well, because surprise, surprise, Christians don't all agree on our political philosophy. But then really help add resources to that and kind of work it out in the work that you're doing as well. So all of those things are opportunities there.
Yeah. It's been a rough week for plants this week. Anyone's been following the social media chatter? Oh, God. So AndCampaign, you can visit our website at andcampaign.org. We have chapters that we would love to grow and start chapters in new cities, and you could email engage@andcampaign.org if you're interested in that. Can you spell that? andcampaign.org. And follow us on social media, and we'll have some, and we just signed a book deal with InterVarsity that will share our model for Christian political engagement, and that'll come out before the election, which is better time than my first book that came out 3 days after Trump's inauguration. So we, learn from our mistakes.
Reclaiming hope.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question, Tyler. So Trinity Forum, we try to provide a platform for the best of Christian thought leadership. We also say we try to provide a space and resources for leaders to grapple with the big questions of life in the context of faith. So we do that through holding lectures and discussions on a whole variety of topics. We just hosted former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts and poet laureate of California, Dana Gioia, speaking on why poetry matters and the role of poetry in beauty, the imagination, and spiritual formation. In a couple of weeks, we'll be hosting James K.A. Smith and Liz Bruning from the Washington Post on Augustine and what he has to teach us about spirituality. So we've tackled topics from a lot on faith in public life, but also the arts, science and faith, and a whole variety of other things as well. So we would love to have you come to those. We'd love to have you as members. Another thing we do is we publish quarterly readings. We're big believers in reading, where we try to take the best of literature and letters and explain why it is important and relevant to today, as well as do different Socratic forums and reading groups around the country. So we're always looking for interns. We'd love to have you come to our events. The next one is October 7th at the National Press Club. I did not bring examples of our readings, but we have several that are on topics like this, including politics, morality, and civility with Václav Havel. We had Ben Sass introduce Alexis de Tocqueville, and we hope they'll be handy guides to essentially contribute to, I think, what's a growing need for a civic catechesis and how that relates to our faith. So if that is of interest to you, I'll be around. Give me your card. Would love to send you a free reading as well as add you to the invitation list. And we're looking for interns as well. So if you're interested, talk with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today to celebrate. For those of you who are sticking around this afternoon, this evening, we'll be starting right over there in the boardroom at 2 p.m. So we have about 20 minutes to mingle. For the ASP folks, we'll see you on Monday. Get excited. And for everybody else, thanks so much. We're really excited for what the next 10 years will bring under this new name, and we're excited to have friends like these to do it with. So thanks, everyone.